Hi, Melissa here. I am in a British literature class, and because I am having some struggles with some of the material that I'm reading for the class, I am going to basically just talk it out, and hopefully that helps me to understand it. And if any of you are taking the same or similar class or reading similar materials, maybe this will help you as well. Today I am talking about Terry Eagleton. We had to read the conclusion and afterword for his book, Literary Theory. And I will include citations in the notes on the video. He discusses what is the point of literary theory, and he says that there's no need to drag politics into literary theory because it's been there from the beginning. And that seems kind of obvious to me, but to be honest, I was an undergraduate political science major for my bachelor's degree, and so I spent a lot of time seeing politics in everything. So I've never not seen politics to some extent in any literature that I've ever read. There's always some reflection of society in the art. Life imitates art, which imitates life over and over again. Excuse me. One thing that he mentions that I do agree with is that literary studies are a question of the signifier and not of the signified. By that, he explains that they, the collective they, your instructors or the others on the critical discourse team or whatever, will remember how you said something, how you spoke the language of literary theory. Long after, they'll remember what you said specifically, which makes perfect sense. And that seems like another statement of the obvious, because unless you have a photographic memory, unless you have video evidence, there's no way to remember exactly what was said, but you can get the gist of it just by remembering the tone of voice and the nature of the conversation. So you'll never, without those other artificial means for the most part, you'll never be able to remember exactly word for word what was going on. And I don't think that's the part that, excuse me, I don't think that's the part that matters. I think what really matters is how it was said. How you communicate matters much more than what you communicate. And that, I think, is ultimately the point of literature in general, is that the way the information is presented reflects a lot more on the reader and the author and society as a whole, more than what information is presented, if that makes sense. We'll see. Then he goes on to discuss the fact that critical discourse is power, and he mentions a few different ways that this is power. I'm reading off of my notes, which is basically just summarizing the important and the salient bits that I saw in the conclusion and the afterwards, so it's kind of jumping around a little bit, but hopefully this all makes a little bit of sense. It's starting to make sense for me. So when he just starts to discuss that critical discourse is power, it seems like he's talking about the power of being an intellectual, which I struggle with, and I'll get into more of the why in just a moment. So his first point is the power of policing language, of determining that certain statements must be excluded because they don't conform to what is sayable. That, I don't like that. I understand that there is that power in the critical discourse of saying this qualifies or this does not, but it feels exclusionary. And I feel like this is bordering into elitist territory that I don't agree with. I think academia, I think the art of being an intellectual should be something that's open to anybody who desires it. Whether or not they're considered an intellectual or not, whether or not they speak the language or not, anybody can learn what to say. How to say it, if you want to say it, you say it. We'll see. Then he talks about the power of policing writing, of classifying literary versus non-literary. Basically, that sounds like being the gatekeepers to what is considered canon or not. And that sounds very much like more elitism to me, because if you're the gatekeeper, you choose who gets to come in. And if you have any amount of bias, that bias is going to show through. And the simple fact of the matter is that everyone has some kind of bias. So the power to be the gatekeeper means that you've got the power to keep people out, but why would you keep this person out and not this person? Why would you keep this text out of the literary canon, but not this one? Is it because Twilight is too much fluff, doesn't have enough substance? Because I could find plenty of people who could argue with that. Is it because Jane Austen, her novel Pride and Prejudice, has so much substance and is so important even today after how much time has passed since she wrote it? I could find people who could argue with that. It goes both ways. Then there's the power of authority and the power of certifying. So the power of authority is the power to define and preserve the discourse, and then the power of certifying if you can or cannot speak the discourse. So that's still just, it comes down to ultimately the power of critical discourse is the power of being the gatekeeper all the way through for the people who write the texts and for the texts themselves. Who gets to pick what's part of the canon? Because it seems like it's probably not me, but why not me? Why can't I pick something? I'm not saying that I'm going to necessarily pick Twilight, but what if I want to pick Harry Potter? Who knows? But right now, I'm not a determiner of the literary canon. So going on to some more notes that I have, and I've got a lot of reactions to these notes, so we'll just talk about this a little bit more, and then I'm going to break this video up and move on to more notes in part 2. He notes that literature is vitally concerned with the living situation of men and women, and that it is concrete and not abstract. This is something that, this is the beginning of my issue with this, because it seems like he's making this too simple. It's more than that. This assumes a universality of experience that I don't think should ever be assumed, because my experience is different from your experience, is different from that guy's experience, or whatever, and saying that literature is concrete and saying that there is no abstraction to it takes away from that differing experience. Takes away from the fact that my childhood, probably not the same as yours, unless you're my sibling, and even then, still gonna be a little different. It's just the way it is. It's chaos theory, I guess. It fails to account for the intersections of marginalization. It fails to account for the fact that this concrete living situation, that's for your concrete living situation is different from mine because maybe yours involves being raised in California and I was raised in Connecticut. Maybe yours involves going to school at a historically black college or university. I went to a public university in South Carolina that was not historically black, so therefore different experiences. So if yours are concrete, then what are mine? There is a certain level of relativism, I think, and I think that trying to find the absolutes is a faulty strategy. I don't think it works, because you're always going to end up leaving somebody out, and somebody who looks like me tends to be left out more often than somebody who looks like Terry Eagleton, if we're going to be blunt. Then he starts talking about such a flight from real history is in part understandable as a reaction to the antiquarian, historically reductionist criticism which held sway in the 19th century. My problem is that he calls it real history like if there is such a thing. Like there's only one history. Like there's a real truth with a capital T. A real history with a capital H. History is written by the victors, not the vanquished. So the history that he is saying is the real history that is understandable as a reaction to the antiquarian and historically reductionist criticism. That real history is probably very different from the history that my family or my ancestors experienced. And this just doesn't account for any of that. And that's distancing, and that's, I keep on saying elitist, but that's really what it feels like, because I don't feel like I personally am an elite intellectual, because technically the elite intellectuals are usually the old white guys. So I hate to be blunt, but there's really not any other way to say it. What can I say? So this doesn't account for the lived experiences of the victors versus the vanquished. It doesn't account for the fact that growing up in poverty is so different than growing up even on the same street, but as a product of wealth. It doesn't account for the real history of the Civil War that doesn't mention the lives of the free black people in the North. It doesn't account for Black History Month. 1 month that is where we squeeze in all of these people who are supposedly important, but it doesn't account for all the rest of the people of color who may have been important in history. If they don't fit into those 28 days, they don't fit. So what is real history? Who decides that? Does he decide it? I don't decide it. I wish I could. I would change a lot of things if I could. Real history says that there are certain tribes of Aboriginal natives of the United States and of the continental US that are extinct, that don't exist anymore. But that's not true. Even a small amount of research would prove that that's not true. So, real history, I have an issue with that. I have an issue with a lot of things. It happens. Then we start going into a weird part where he says that you must not sound as though you are speaking another language altogether. To do so is to recognize in the sharpest way that critical discourse is power. All I'm hearing there is assimilate. Be the same. Speak the language that is accepted, and then you will have power. If you don't speak the language that is accepted, you don't have power. Accept the canon and talk about it the same way that everybody else does, and then you can be part of the group, part of the in-group. But if you don't, you're part of the out-group. You're the other, you don't belong. I feel like most of this conclusion involves delineating exactly how it is that intellectuals belong or don't belong. If you agree with me, you're in my group, and if you don't, you're not. You're either with us or you're against us, and I feel like that's a false binary. I feel like that's something that doesn't account for the minute ideas that can come in between. It doesn't account for the variance of, I can agree with you with some things, but not with everything. So what does that mean? Does that mean that I'm against you or part of the other because I don't agree with you 100%? Is this an all or nothing sort of deal? That's the impression that I get from this reading. And so I'll talk a little bit more about it in my next video, but I just wanted to share some thoughts and just kind of talk through my reactions to this, and hopefully this helps you, and hopefully it helps me. We'll see. Thanks.